Hi, everyone. Welcome to Big Tent USA. My name is Kitty Douglas, and I am president of the organization. At Big Tent, we are steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, the Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower you with facts and calls to action so you can become a more effective advocate for the country we all love. On Monday at 1 o'clock, we welcome back the Brennan Center's Michael Waldman and Kimberly Atkins-Storr to break down SCOTUS's end-of-term decisions. We had some doozies today with more to follow, no doubt. So please register for that event and join us with your lunch. Our call to action tonight is our letter writing campaigns with our partners Vote Forward and Vote Riders. After 2024, I know that many of us are skeptical of letter writing, but our partners have done their homework and are using data to inform their programs. We have letters to Arizona, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. So click the link in the chat and start writing your letters. So usually what I do is I introduce the candidates, but I really wanted to hear directly from Bill and Jonathan because their backgrounds are so interesting. And for those of us in the lower 48, unless you've been to Alaska, I don't think you can imagine what it's like to live there. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill first. Just want to hear your background, Bill, and why you're running, and then we'll pass it to Jonathan. And thanks so much for joining Big Tent, gentlemen.
Oh, absolutely a pleasure. Thank you so much. And, one of the things that I get asked continually across the course of this campaign is what gives you hope, in times when we are facing some very dark things. And you people do give me hope. It's people who are looking at elections differently. People are looking at our government differently and realizing what we've been doing for the decades and decades is not working. So thank you for doing the work, the actions it takes to create hope. My name's Bill Hill. I'm a lifelong Alaskan. I'm a Dena'ina Athabascan. I live in Naknek out in Bristol Bay, which is home of the greatest sockeye salmon run in the world. And if you want world-class sockeye, get some from Bristol Bay, please. But I started out in the little village of Kokkinok on Iliamna Lake. We were just over 100 people, and it was a bush frontier upbringing. We didn't have TV or telephones or radio. We spent a lot of time outdoors, hunting, fishing, picking berries. We didn't have running water, so we had that 40-yard to the outhouse run even in the dead of winter. And we did a lot of work. We had to chop wood, we had to pack water, just to kind of keep heat and water in our house. We raised dog teams. My family had dog teams, and it was a really good upbringing. I am so very fortunate to have had that life, to be able to work with family, learn how to work hard at a very young age, but really learn to enjoy the fruits of your labors that directly made your life better. It was so great. When I was a sophomore in high school, we moved to Naknek, which was in a borough of about 1,000 people. And so it was like for us moving to the big city, right? Because in Kokkinok, I had a single classmate. Her name was Little Nancy, and then we moved to Naknek, and I had 12 classmates. So it was a huge change for us. But Naknek is where I started my work life. At 8 years old, I started set netting, and I started commercial fishing. And I still do it to this day. I own a drift boat operation and I raised my kids on the boat. They learned to work really hard. They learned to work with Mother Nature and they learned to work beyond what many of us have, which are self-perceived limitations. And working with family has just always been a great part of life. Um, I also worked as a construction worker for a good portion of my life. I did everything from laying sewer lines to building houses, and I have a really broad experience. The proverbial jack of all and master of none. And then finally, I joined the family profession, which is education. Both my parents were educators, and um, I had the opportunity to live a life where I spent 25 years as a teacher, a principal, and a superintendent, working with students and building programs for students to help them find pathways to really good lives. When you're working as a construction worker, you build the infrastructure of the communities so that they can thrive. But then when you're working as an educator, you're building young people so they can live in those communities and thrive and build families and homes. And that was just such rewarding work. And then finally, I'm a small business owner with my wife, Diane, And it was mostly her effort, but we built Bristol Bay Brailer, which manufactures textile products for the commercial fishing industry. We're trying to keep some of the work and some of the money in our hometown that the commercial fishery essentially extracts. Most importantly, I'm the father of four, and I'm the chudda, which is the Denana word for grandpa, chudda of seven, and the eighth one will be coming this year. And, I look around at a nation and a state where I'm really worried. I'm really worried that our democracy is failing. I'm worried we don't have good representation of real people in Congress. We don't have people willing to stand up and fight for our ideals, fight for lives for our children and grandchildren, so that, they can work hard like I did and build good lives and have families. And so, yeah, I'm running for Congress because I think we deserve real people in Congress. I think we deserve a different way of looking at politics. I think we deserve people who are willing to fight to make sure that Congress is a separate but equal branch of government that holds the others accountable, and someone who fights for the rule of law, and somebody who fights to make Alaskan and American lives better. And so my name is Bill Hill. I'm running for Congress. Thanks.
Yeah, my name's Jonathan Kreiss-Tomkins. I grew up in an island community on the sort of other southern corner of Alaska and Southeast Alaska in a community called Sitka. And small town by national standards, bustling metropolis of 8,000 people by Alaska standards. We had a McDonald's in Sitka. No longer. We lost it a couple of years ago, but that was like the metric of metropolis in Alaska, and had also an amazing Alaska upbringing that I'm incredibly grateful for. The backyard of my parents' house was the Tongass National Forest, and grew up in the woods and playing in tide pools on the beach, and eating a lot of salmon and halibut for dinner. And I got politically involved at a really young age, and neither of my parents are particularly political. But when I was 13, through the wonders of the internet, I discovered electoral politics and got involved in a presidential campaign as a 13-year-old for Howard Dean back in 2002. And I didn't tell the campaign how old I was. And they were thrilled to have somebody in Alaska. And this was like the very, very early days of the Howard Dean presidential campaign. So like December 2002. And sort of gave me the reins to build out the campaign in Alaska, which was an amazing experience. And as folks might know, that campaign went from an absolutely like blip on the radar campaign and candidacy to something that was a national phenomenon, and for a while a front runner for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2004. So that was my introduction to politics, and I met a lot of amazing people around Alaska and around the country through that, including Howard himself, who has been like a wonderful mentor and supporter over the years. And I kind of lived the rest of my high school life as a normal, if politically involved, young Sitkin, and I went back to college back east. And in my senior year of school, a couple people I'd worked with in politics when I was in high school called and asked if I'd think about running for the legislature against the 8-year Republican incumbent for Southeast Alaska. And at that point in time, there were some really big issues in Alaska around oil taxes and who was, how the sort of revenues from Alaska's oil resource were being split up. Was it going to the big multinational corporations, or was it going to Alaskans and Alaska communities? And I felt really strongly about that. And I dropped out of school, moved back home to Sitka, and launched a campaign for state legislature against this entrenched incumbent. And I think he felt sort of complacent and comfortable, like he kind of owned the office. He owned the seat. And we built this really high energy grassroots campaign across this region about the size of Connecticut, bunch of island communities, and narrowly won in 2012 by 32 votes. And that was the beginning of my 10-year legislative chapter as a representative for the Southeast region, during which time I had the great fortune of meeting Bill, who was a superintendent for the Bristol Borough School District. So met a lot of amazing Alaskans, Bill very much among them, in that time, and also was really involved in helping build what is the unique phenomenon in Alaska, the bipartisan coalition that exists in the legislature, which, for those not familiar, is the only thing of its kind in the United States. Although, hopefully, with a little bit of luck, and especially if Bill is able to win this election, we can recreate it in the U.S. House of Representatives, if not in other state legislatures. But it is this multi-partisan sort of coalition of all the Democrats, as well as a faction of independents that we've elected to the Alaska House of Representatives, as well as a group of more moderate, reasonable Republicans. And everybody joins forces, caucuses together, governs together. And I think it is a wonderful approach to politics that the country and Alaska desperately needs. And we first formed that coalition in Alaska in 2016. A decade later, it is still in power in the House of Representatives. A similar coalition has since come into power in the Alaska Senate. And so Alaska is really leading the way nationally in terms of this kind of cross-partisan collaboration and setting aside partisan politics to take a more collaborative approach to governance that is focused on finding common ground and solving problems and making everyday people's lives better, rather than sort of partisan warfare and sort of running to the ideological fringes. So I'm a big believer in that approach to politics. I left the legislature in 2022 and launched the campaign for governor earlier this year in February. And we've been trying to recreate the same magic from 2012, a really high energy grassroots campaign. I'm running with an independent as my lieutenant governor running mate. And his name is Zach Johnson. He's an elected official from Anchorage, serves on the Anchorage Assembly, a lifelong independent, a Marine Corps veteran, a former state trooper. And we're really excited about the ticket that we're building, and that it sort of mirrors and represents that same kind of cross-partisan energy in Alaska that exists in the legislature of, a D and an I working together sort of side by side. And we think there's just like Alaska has been very interested in that model of governance in the legislature, we're really excited to sort of make that an option for the executive branch and in the governor's office. So that's a little bit about me. And as Bill said, very grateful to be a part of this conversation.
I mean, I love hearing you guys tell your stories. It's incredible. As we were talking before the call started, I have been fortunate enough to go to Alaska twice. And as I was telling you guys, I really only spent time in Prince William Sound, this sort of the southeast corner of the big part, not where Sitka is, but and then into Denali. So that's a very small part of the state. And so I think for those of us who live in the lower 48, even if you live in Texas, for instance, Alaska is a totally different scale. It is the words magnificent and awe-inspiring and breathtaking don't really do it justice. So I would love to have you guys each tell us what it's like to run a statewide campaign in Alaska and how you are managing that in 2026. What is traditional and what is different? And so, Bill, why don't you tell us? This is your first race. This is your first campaign. What you're doing and how it's going.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. And I don't really have experience doing anything different than this. Even in high school, when we went to play basketball, we'd hop on a small plane and fly to another village to play basketball or wrestle or cross country, whatever it was. And much like my high school experience, that's what campaigning in Alaska looks like. We did take a road trip. It was a couple-day road trip. We visited 3 communities and we traveled 500 miles to visit 3 communities. But then in the past last month, in about a month's time, I was on 17 different flight segments. We traveled over 5,000 miles. We hit, oh my gosh, we hit Kodiak, Ketchikan, Nome, Fairbanks, Fort Yukon, Sitka, Juneau. We were all over the state, but it took a lot of miles. And some of them were on small planes, planes that would only hold 8 or 10 people. And then there were some really interesting experiences too, where, you'd get off the plane in Ketchikan and you'd have to take a ferry from the island that the airstrip was on to the city of Ketchikan on the other side. And it was like a 3-minute ferry ride, but just some interesting dynamics. But The people of Alaska are amazing. If you have the opportunity to visit and travel in Alaska, I highly recommend it. I've just got to meet such wonderful people and learn about our commonalities and also some of the very specific differences each community has. I even got to be involved with the blanket toss, which was unbelievable. If you don't know what the blanket toss is, look it up online. But I went from helping pull this very large skin hide where somebody was standing on it, helping pull and shoot them into the air. And then 5 minutes later, here I was in the middle of it being shot 12 feet in the air. So it was just what an amazing experience this has been. I've been able to travel around and it's very unique, but it's very Alaskan. Thanks.
Yeah, Jonathan, you've had a lot more experience campaigning in Alaska. So tell us about that and sort of how you've morphed how you campaign over time, your use of social media, if there's like local news organizations that you work with, tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd plus one Bill's comments. I mean, Alaska is an incredible state. It's phenomenally rural, and most of the state, geographically speaking, is roadless. So you can't basically drive to most communities in Alaska. It's a lot of Alaska Airlines flights, a lot of bush plane or puddle hopper flights, and a lot of boats, ferries, skiffs, all of it. And I mean, that was my legislative district for 10 years. Literally every community in my district was on an island, most of them different islands. So lots of that for 10 years in Southeast Alaska. And it's just sort of been at a greater scale. I mean, I used to take my own skiff to go from one community to the next in order to get to some of the really remote parts of my old legislative district. And I mean, that's like what I would do for fun. I mean, so it's like, sort of like wonderful to have that kind of alignment where you're like in the backcountry and you're seeing some of the most beautiful parts of the world, and you're also like visiting with the people who you're trying to represent or you do represent. And we've been scaling that for our campaign. We did a 300-mile Arctic snow machine trip to a string of villages just north of the Arctic Circle in April, and we're going to do some similar travel this summer to a bunch of villages. And I think to your question, it's like getting there physically, geographically is a really key aspect of campaigning for me and Bill. But it's also like the digital commons, and I sort of Facebook has sort of become the sort of, I don't know, the metaverse has. I mean, I roll my eyes as I say that, but that's what Mark Zuckerberg would say. But where there's just kind of this like digital community and all these like Facebook groups and sort of watering holes in Alaska, and being engaged there as well, and our campaign teams sort of being engaged and driving the conversation in positive ways in all of those sort of forums digitally is a really key part of the campaign. And I think in Alaska, where there's so much remoteness, the digital connectivity that exists, I think, sort of plays a disproportionate sort of role. And so, we really want to be there in person, in the flesh, getting to those hard to reach communities, and also at the same time, in parallel, trying to be really present and engaged in the sort of digital side of things as well.
So you've both traveled the state. It's amazing the ground that you've covered. And so I think we'd love to hear from you both. What's top of mind for Alaskans? What are you hearing from, people you want to represent? Just give us a sense for, what's happening on the ground. And then I'd love to get in a little bit more to ranked choice voting and the independence of it all. So Bill, why don't you start us off?
I mean, I think it reflects what we're all feeling across this nation, the cost of living. Alaskans are worried about the cost of living. And specifically, when we start talking about Bush Alaska, and when I say Bush Alaska, I mean communities that are only accessible by air. And, I come from a community called Naknek. Our fuel price, we get fuel in the spring. Our winter fuel supply lasts until spring. And then in the spring, we get this fuel barge that shows up. And we went from paying $6.70 a gallon for our gasoline, and it went up to almost $9 a gallon once the fuel barge showed up. But it's not just the cost of fuel, it's also sort of like this fragile infrastructure of delivery. These supply systems, these supply chains are so fragile There was a part in this spring where I had to fly to my home community because our house was out of heating fuel and the community had no more for sale. So I had to throw a drum in the back of my truck, drive to my business, pump some fuel out of my business's drum into my drum in the back of my truck, take it back to my house, pump it back into my house because the house was at 40 some degrees and falling. And, we needed to get the heat back on. So, we look at these really fragile supply chains. We look at high costs, like some of the communities that surround, and we're actually pretty low for our region in terms of costs, but some of our communities are looking at $15 a gallon heating fuel this winter, which means people are making a choice. There are people who are saying they can no longer live in their communities. They're going to have to leave. And this is a result of haphazard tariffs and a war in the Middle East that nobody wants. So the cost of living is front of mind. You talk about the lack of the ACA health credits. And, I talked to one young lady in Sitka. She was paying over $400 a month for her family for health care. With the loss of the ACA premiums, it went to over $3,000 a month. How does a family absorb that? I know my family couldn't. I know people are making choices between healthcare and housing, between gas and groceries. People are hurting, and they need people in Washington, D.C. who understand that and are going to go to bat for them.
Jonathan, you might even have some data for us. I'm not sure. Is this
Uh,
our data? Is this when we bring out the data? You
no, I
don't
mean,
have to.
I'd echo Bill. It's like it's cost of living is these like basic, how do you survive in this country, in this state kinds of questions that are really front of mind for Alaskans. And I mean, it's a great sort of compliment to be running alongside Bill because the federal government has certain policy levers that they can drive, that can help Americans, that can help Alaskans, and the state government has its own sort of set of things it can do to help Alaskans. And ideally, government is helping people. Like ideally, our government is making people's lives better. Like that's how our system should work, and that's what we're trying to do at sort of different offices and different levels. I mean, at the state level, cost of energy and electricity is really key, and the state has a lot that it can do to make Alaska more affordable for Alaskans. Cost of childcare and cost of housing. Those are three areas where the state can play a real leadership role through a variety of mechanisms. So we're really focused on that. We're focused on schools, which pretty much everybody cares about, especially in rural communities in Alaska. Schools are the cornerstone institution of the community, as Bill knows, as well as anyone in the state having a career educator. And schools are closing across Alaska. Teachers are leaving the profession because they're underpaid and they have no retirement here. And the kinds of classes and extracurriculars that enrich the school experience for kids that I benefited from as like a proud product of the Sitka school district. Music, art, sports, all of those kinds of activities are getting cut as well. And as a result, parents are losing confidence in the quality of Alaska schools. And I've spoken with many families, including a couple that have actually outright left the state and moved to the lower 48 because they felt they had to in order to get their kids an education they could be confident in. I've spoken with many other families that are sort of teetering and wavering and sort of asking that question. So it's really incumbent at the state level to reverse that decline in public education and restore Alaska public schools to where they once were, which was one of the best systems of public education in the United States. So that's a real sort of front burner issue in the governor's race as well, is supporting our schools and reinvesting in public education.
So I'd like to just pull on that thread a little bit more. We had James Tellerico come in December to Big Tent before he had won the nomination. And a lot of what was happening in Texas was around the voucher program and how the voucher program was really decimating funding of public school. And there's also like a real like religious component into not wanting to teach books and topics and all that stuff. But so what's happening in Alaska that's impacting public schools so negatively? Bill, why don't you start since this is what you do?
Well, this is what I did.
Oh, you did.
I,
Right. Now you're running for
I
Congress.
was now I'm running for Congress, but hopefully we can have an impact on public education from Washington, D.C. as well. But yeah, Alaska education has been, from my perspective, so take
Yeah.
this with a Bill Hill grain of salt here, has been under attack for decades. I did my own study. I had the fortune of being the superintendent at the same school that I started teaching in. My very first teacher's contract was still in the file cabinet. I compared that with my mom's, who had started teaching, 20 some years earlier than I did. And when adjusted for the rate of inflation, I was already behind at the start of my teaching career. And I'll tell you, my very first job fair here in Alaska, I went to a place in Anchorage here. It's a big hotel, and there were over 800 candidates for just a handful of jobs. Alaska was a place to be. Alaska is where you could get a good retirement, where you could get paid well, you could live in this amazing country. And and that's gone away. We have not invested in education for decades the way we should have. The last job fair I was at, which was 3 years ago, there was, oh, I'd say there's like 40 some odd superintendents in the room. There were less than 20 candidates for teaching who showed up with tons of jobs available. We've been relegated to hiring visa candidates to teach in our schools. Some of our schools up north are over 80% Filipino visa can people, which is great. We appreciate having them on the ground, but it just shows you that our education system has really been underfunded for a long time. And one of the key components that I don't think people really understand is our lack of a retirement system means that as a superintendent, I would hire these great young teachers, and they would come to Alaska, and I would the school district would dump a bunch of money and a bunch of training into them so that after 3 years, they became pretty good teachers. And then the next 2 years, they started really getting their feet on the ground and becoming effective. And then at the fifth year, they had maximized their benefit with the state's retirement, which is a sort of a 401 style retirement system. And they're at the place when they want to build a house, they want to build a family. They look down south to the lower 48, they see higher wages, they see defined benefit retirement programs, and they see a lower cost of living. And when they're doing the calculus to build a home and have a family, there is no option. They leave the state even if they want to stay there and they love it. So that impacts us so greatly because you have this reoccurring revolving door of new teachers, and you miss the 5 year to retirement teachers, which are so important to the stability of schools, so important for the knowledge, so important for the mentorship of younger teachers. They need to be a part of what we do, and we've lost them. Our state's lost its way with education. We need greater investment, and we need to make sure that Congress is a champion for public education. I truly believe that public education is a cornerstone of democracy. It's where we go to work, live, and play together as young people. We learn to appreciate different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds. We get to appreciate the people across the tracks in some places. And we need to revitalize education because as Jonathan said, Alaska had one of the best education systems in the nation. And although there are legislators who tell us, why should we give you more money if you're not performing very well? I'll tell you why. Take a look at our history, and that tells you exactly what the problem is. We haven't invested, and that's why our outcomes are so bad. But with that, the voucher system is a target on public education. You know what's going to happen. We're going to have private schools, we're going to have religiously oriented schools who will take that voucher and they'll immediately raise the cost of going to school there by the same amount as that voucher. And all the people who are locked out of those systems now who want to access them will continue to be locked out. It's not going to change anything. And I also want you to keep an eye on, this seems like a very knowledgeable group, keep an eye on some of the tax credits that are going to be handed out to set aside money for private education systems through the tax system. That's going to start hitting us hard too. Anyhow, huge, huge fan of public education. I believe in it. I believe it's a cornerstone of our democracy. Let's make sure we protect it and fund it.
Yeah. So Jonathan, what would you do as governor to reinvigorate public education in Alaska with your, this amazing bipartisan coalition that you've helped build.
Yeah. I mean, it is a real team effort to build what we have in Alaska and sustain it. And I think we're so fortunate. If you look through Alaska history, this is arguably one of the best legislatures the state has seen in decades. And so, like, it's hard to focus on the positive because the current governor, who we haven't talked about, is uh, a dumpster fire, just with smoke billowing up, clouding the horizon. And the good news, I mean, he is just awful legacy for the state, unfortunately. And I think the fortunate part is Alaskans see that, and according to Morning Consult polling, he's the most unpopular governor of the 50 governors in the United States. And so he's going out tucked tail between legs, and Alaskans are ready for a change, and I think really disillusioned by the sort of legacy of disinvestment and decline that he has brought to Alaska. So we are one governor's election away from being able to usher in some really big wins for the state and turn things around, because we have a legislature that's ready to get things done, and if they have a governor they can work with, we can do some really big and exciting things in Alaska. And I mean, the political term is trifecta, and we've got two of the three in Alaska. Two of the three are really run by reasonable elected officials, and if we can get the governor's office in a good place, you've got three of three, and you can pass a really transformative agenda. So to your question, Kitty, forgive the preamble there, but just to give a little bit more context, I mean, education funding is primarily a state responsibility, and Julie, to your question in the chat, Congress, Mary Peltola, education is a little bit out of their domain, and so it's really the responsibility of the state. In fact, it's a mandate in the Alaska Constitution that the state of Alaska provide Alaskan children an adequate public education. And so the question is, can we get funding back up to par? And this current governor has sort of, through the tyranny of the veto pen, steadily cut education funding down to these sort of bare bone levels that parents and teachers and just community members are really revolting against across Alaska. So the number one item is getting education funding back up to par so that our schools can be vibrant again. And there's a revenue side of the question: where does the money come from? And there's a sort of parallel conversation about Alaska getting its fair share from our oil resource, which I'm hugely motivated by. That was really the issue that prompted me to drop out of college and run for the legislature back in 2012. And in its own way is sort of front burner again. It's a really front and center issue in Alaska. So adequate funding, restoring, as Bill was saying, a retirement that teachers can actually depend on. Right now, if you are a teacher in Alaska, you are effectively inflicting financial self-harm on yourself. It is a financially irrational thing to do, to be in the teaching profession. You don't have a retirement. The pay is not great. You can make much more in the lower 48 in Washington or other states, or in other professions in Alaska. And I mean, it's a real testament, frankly, that people continue to teach because that's where their heart is. But that's just awful. And we have to change that equation as soon as possible. And I think the legislature is ready to do that. The governor has been the barrier, again, through that veto pen. But again, we're one governor's election away from positive change. And that's why I'm running. And that's the change that we're going to bring to the governor's office.
Yeah, that's so exciting. It is just really heartwarming to hear one governor's race away from real change. But that didn't happen overnight, of course. The coalition you built, and also the way that you run elections in Alaska. And so there's a couple questions in the chat about ranked choice voting, how it works, and why you think it could be, if you think it could be, an election reform to restore voter confidence across the United States. So give us your selling point for ranked choice voting.
Well, I'll start this one. And I'm going to speak to this from the perspective of not being a politician, not being involved in a lot of the background on this. But my metric for government that's doing the work of the people is, are they getting shit done? Are they doing stuff? And when I started traveling to Juneau to work with our legislature as a school administrator, for years you just saw the sides getting further and further apart until they were basically stuck. They weren't getting anything done. At the end of the session, they would throw together this big turducken of a bill that covered basic costs and throw it out the window, and they wouldn't get the actual work of the Alaska people done. But boy, we installed open primaries and ranked choice voting, and you immediately saw this move towards the center, this move towards multi-partisan coalitions, this move towards actually getting things done for the Alaska people. And you see that now. They're doing the work of the Alaska people. They even go so far as to override the governor's veto, and they've done that multiple times. And that requires, I believe, a 75% majority, which is mind-blowing, right? They're actually standing up for the Alaska people now. And I think that our vote electoral system has had a direct impact on that. Otherwise, we'd be falling in line with the other states who are strictly tied to very partisan politics. So from, a non-informed view, other than having worked with the legislature on a regular basis over a decade, I think it's had a very positive impact on Alaska politics. And I think we need to make sure that other states adopt things like this. And I think we need to work towards making sure that this is a part of what happens in Washington, D.C. as well.
Great. Jonathan,
Give
us your pitch.
Echo everything Bill said. I mean, I think it is the single most undervalued, single most transformative, positive intervention for American democracy out there, which is reforming and improving our election system so that the average voter is fully represented through our system and structure of elections. And we formed the bipartisan coalition in the House before election reform in the era of partisan primaries, and some of the sort of hoop jumping and end run strategizing that we had to come up with to allow independents to be able to win, to allow moderate Republicans to have a lane to win, were incredibly difficult. I mean, it was possible, and it happened, we did it, but it was like defying gravity. And when election reform was passed in Alaska in 2020 and implemented in 2022, I would say there's been a sea change of results. And as Bill described, again, there were positive things that were sort of underway and gaining momentum before the system, but supercharged afterwards. And you no longer have legislators who know what the right thing is and want to cast a vote in a certain way, but are sort of looking over their shoulder, worried about their closed partisan primary the next year. Even if they know that vote is in alignment with the majority of their overall general election voters, sort of solving that primary election problem is such a huge sea change. And I don't want to generalize too much, but I would say it's especially true on the Republican side of the aisle. And in my conversations with Republican colleagues, frequently before election reform, man, I know this is the right vote. I know a majority of my voters are there, but my Republican primary, I don't know if I could get away with it. And now, we've gotten rid of the closed party primary system. You have legislators governing in a fundamentally different way that is more resonant with what their constituents as a whole want, and also what they truly personally believe, which is that is an improvement. That is an improvement. And I'm really hopeful that the system of opening up primaries can be brought to other states. And I think the political benefits and the benefits to our democracy will be abundant if we can sort of scale this across the country.
Have there been efforts, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like I read that there were efforts to undo ranked choice voting in Alaska, but it got shot down. Is that right? God forbid. We keep something that works.
We're in Groundhog Day up here. So there was an initiative to repeal it in 2024, and that narrowly failed. And the same merry band of fringe political warriors have reunited this coming election cycle in 2026 to try to repeal it again via a ballot initiative. Although, Bill, I don't know what you think. I sort of harbor cautious optimism that not only will they fail again, but probably, or I certainly hope, by a stronger margin than even in 2024.
I would hope that that's the outcome, especially when you base your rhetoric on Alaskan people are too dumb to figure out how to do ranked choice voting. So I hope we maintain it. It's the best thing that's happened to us in a long time.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like good marketing, actually. No. So I'd love to get into the independent of it all. It's the majority of your electorate is either independent or unaffiliated. So what voter demographics are most likely to identify as independent in Alaska? And what does it take to build that statewide platform for you guys to run these campaigns? I'm going to give it to you, Bill.
He's the independent.
Because
He's
he's
more
an
qualified.
independent. That's
I
right.
am the, I
You
guess
have
I
the
am the
I.
independent.
You've got the I by your name.
Well, as you said, 60, about approximately 60% of Alaskans do not identify with the Republican or Democratic Party. And I think if I remember the statistics right, I don't have anything to share with you on the screen, but I think it's approximately 26% of people are with the Republican Party, and approximately 13% of people are registered with the Democratic Party. So by and large, Alaskans tend to have sort of this independent ethos that, is just a part of the Alaska thing. When we talk about people who are both pro-choice and pro-Second Amendment, that's sort of, kind of like an Alaskan kind of a thing. But for the particular campaign that I'm running, we know that we're going to have to build a coalition that's based on the coastal fishing communities, that's based on the urban centers of Alaska, that includes the bush populations, the fly-in only populations, the Alaska Native people, the Alaska Native organizations, and I'm neglected to mention that I was a 15-year member of my village corporation, PAVIC. I was the last 10 years as the president, so I have a deep understanding of village corporations and village politics. And then we definitely have to include things like the educators of Alaska, which have a huge voting population. But more importantly, we have to make sure that we include the working people of Alaska. We are the only campaign that's endorsed by unions. And I think we're up to the most recent count is up to 8 or 10 unions have endorsed the campaign, including the AFL-CIO and such strange bedfellows as the firefighters and the National Education Association. So we know that this campaign can represent what historically has been a powerful coalition that can defeat Republican incumbents. And so that's what it's going to take. And yes, Alaskans are independent overall, but there are some strange things out there too. And you'll have people in coastal fishing communities that'll vote for, the Trump at the top of the ticket, but they'll vote across party lines further down the ballot. And yeah, I think representing all Alaskans from all walks of life, all kind of different communities is what my campaign is about. And I think that's kind of how we win in this state.
Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah,
Now,
I think
you have a D by your name. So
I have a D
that's
in my name. Yeah. I mean, I've been a Democrat since I was 18 years old. I'm not a fundamentally partisan person. I'm an Alaskan first. I'm an American first. I think that's true of most Alaskans and most Americans, even if they are a member of a political party. That you ultimately care about the greater good, and you want to work together to do good things. And that was my MO as a legislative candidate and as a legislator. And I represented, a rural coastal district, very mixed politics. There were some blue pockets, there were some deep red pockets that voted for Donald Trump. And I was really proud of being able to win and then win re-election cycle after cycle in a tough purple swingy district for a Democrat with really large margins of support, not just from the Democrats, but from independents and moderate Republicans. And so, I mean, in my various reelection cycles, I had some of the highest rates of that kind of crossover support of conservative voters. You know, they're voting for Donald Trump as much as I um, uh, wish he weren't president. They were voting for him and they were voting for me on the same ballot. And I'm really proud of that. And I think that comes from just treating everybody with respect and wanting to meet people where they are, and like avoiding the politics of condescension, and talking down to people, and trying to focus on issues that everybody can agree on, like public schools or reducing fisheries bycatch, or supporting basic infrastructure like the ferry system, these kinds of issues. And I think if you choose to focus on those issues, you can bring in those people who are I's, who are R's into your coalition. And I did that for 10 years as a legislator. We're doing that again in this governor's campaign, and running with an independent, Zach Johnson, I think is really exciting to me. It's like that's a feature, not a bug of the ticket, to have that kind of cross-partisan composition. And just to the previous question, Kitty, that's another sort of way in which election reform in Alaska, I think, really creates more political opportunity and opportunities for expression, that you can have a ticket for governor and lieutenant governor that cuts across party lines. That was not previously possible in the state, and it is now. And I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. So before we wrap, I could talk to you guys all night, honestly. It's been so fun. But I did want to get into the fishing of it all, and just how important, which I didn't understand until I got to spend a couple of months on Prince William Sound, how important the fishing industry is to Alaska. Bill, you've done it your entire life. It's your family, it's your inheritance, and you've given it to your children. And Jonathan, you've made fisheries protection a centerpiece of your platform. So what are the biggest threats to the Alaska fishing industry, and what are some solutions that you guys are talking about with Alaskans as you travel around the state? And Bill, why don't we let you take it first?
Boy, just starting off with the question, fishing industry, right? I mean, right there, Alaska is, when you want to talk about difficult politics, you talk about fishing in Alaska, because just by phrasing the fishing industry, it neglects the subsistence fishermen and the sports fishermen and all these other user groups that are used to having traditional access. And so, super complicated issue in our state.
Bill, I'm from the lower 48, so it's all one thing. So thank you.
No, no. So, subsistence fishing means you set a net and you catch fish. It's not for fun, it's for food. But it is cultural. It has a cultural component and a fun component and a family component to it. Like my people have been living off of sockeye salmon for thousands of years. And then you have sports fishermen. But I would say that there are more recent developed in my neck of the woods who come out to catch fish one at a time and have a good time in the outdoors and maybe catch a trophy or take a nice picture or something, which is an important part of our economy out there. But then the other fishery that I'm involved in is commercial fishing. And, in Bristol Bay, a long history of one of the most successfully managed fisheries on the planet, if not the most successfully managed. So, we have all of these user groups, and then we have some fisheries which are a little different, because ours in Bristol Bay are more of a mom and pop family-oriented fishery. But there are some real issues with factory-based trawlers who are based out of Seattle and Oregon. Most of the money and most of the jobs with those industrial grade trawlers, most of it's out of state, right? I think 80 some percent of the money that's earned off those industries goes out of state. Approximately 80% of the jobs or more are people from out of state. So we have these industrial grade trawlers. We have communities in the Yukon and the Kuskokwim who no longer are able to commercial fish and are no longer able to subsistence fish. It's hurting communities. It's hurting their ability to carry on their culture. They no longer have this food source that helps them get through the winter. And there's a lot of things, right, that impact the runs. But what we do know is that the trawlers are impacting the runs by something called bycatch. The trawlers are out there trying to catch a specific species of fish called pollock. But in the meantime, they're also decimating the seafloor, running over crabs and clams and all the other environmental factors on the seafloor. And they're also catching things like, well, crabs, halibut, salmon, and some of the species that actually would migrate up to those villages that no longer have access to either commercial or subsistence fishing. So that's a huge threat. It's a threat on many levels, and that's something that the state is absolutely fighting with each other over because it's such a complex issue. Because, yes, the trawlers bring money to places like Unalaska and Kodiak, but then the bycatch impacts the subsistence sports and other commercial use fishing of that same fishery. So it's really complicated. We have a lot of work to do, but I think as with everything in Alaska, you need to start by talking to the people who are on the ground and impacted by the decisions that are being made. With the North Pacific Marine Fisheries Council, which oversees trawling, historically, most of the people on that board are really industry representatives. We need to make sure that the state's governor, and hopefully JKT will be really responsive as a governor to this, make sure that all user groups are included on that board so that the decisions that are made are not just in the best interests of industry, they're also in the best interest of all the people of Alaska. And then finally, a lot of the fisheries have become overcapitalized. A lot of young people don't have access to the fisheries. So these families that have raised young fishermen, their young people are not able to buy into the industry because it's been overcapitalized and a lot of the ownership is out of state. But I'll stop there because Jonathan has a lot on this as well. Thanks.
Oh man, yeah, I totally agree with everything Bill said, and it's like a third rail or fourth rail of Alaska politics. And here I got screen share privileges, so I'm gonna exercise that power.
Oh, are we gonna
Um,
see some stuff, some data?
we're all about fish on these campaigns, and here's the obligatory, cute photo from growing up, which is just to say, like, just in my Southeast Alaska part of the state, just as in Bill's Southwest part of the state, it's all about fish. And I mean, everybody has a connection to salmon and fish in Alaska. And the bycatch issue, which Bill mentioned, is white hot. And man, I busted my butt in the legislature for 10 years when most of the legislature couldn't even tell you what the North Pacific Council was trying to reduce fisheries bycatch for salmon, for halibut, for sablefish, to reduce the influence of sort of industrial scale trawling in both the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. Is probably, I mean, I think it's fair to say I was the most active legislator of the 60 on those issues for a decade. And in the last couple of years, it's blown up. And, because I have a record, we're really going to position ourselves in this race as a leader on these issues. And there are a lot of commercial fisheries leaders across Alaska, not just commercial, but also subsistence fisheries leaders across Alaska who, I have worked with really closely for the better part of 15 years, who are going to be sort of stepping up and sharing, their perspective on how important these issues are, and also, their belief that, our ticket can bring the change that I think Alaskans are really hungry for. And the other issue I'll mention, which Bill alluded to and is most sort of prevalent in Bristol Bay, well, actually really all of rural coastal Alaska, is the loss of access to this industry by the people who live there. And in the Bristol Bay watershed, in the Kodiak Archipelago, in rural Southeast Alaska, fishing permits, which is that's the means of access to be able to earn a livelihood in this industry, have been slowly and steadily leaving the communities and the families that often have been fishing commercially since the advent of commercial fishing in the late 1800s in Alaska. And it's a real socioeconomic sort of slow motion tragedy. It drives, it drives poverty. It creates a loss of like economic self-determination in these communities. And that was an issue also as a legislator that I worked on very, very hard for 10 years. That's actually how I met Bill's son-in-law, is sort of through work with fisheries leaders, trying to allow coastal communities in Alaska to be able to participate in these fisheries economically the way they have for the last 100+ years. And so that's an incredibly important issue. And, one that we're also championing in this governor's race and will act on when elected. So it's an incredibly important issue. I think, Bill and I both, have a connection to it and are big believers that we want to be fish first candidates. And I think there's a lot of appetite for that from Alaskans as well.
Oh, thank you so much. We're at time. And so I just want to thank everyone who joined us tonight and to both of you for your thoughtful discussion, for sharing who you are and why you're running and why Alaska is such a special, unique place, but a part of the United States. And we all love our country, whether we're in the lower 48 or we're up in God's country where you guys are. Bill Hill is going to make us some Hill Yeah t-shirts that we can buy and support his candidacy. We'll give you the link when they come out. And I hope everyone takes a look at both their candidacies, their campaigns, share this conversation with your friends and bring attention to what's going on in Alaska, because it will have a huge impact on the rest of us in November. And for coming to Big Tent tonight, everyone, thanks for joining us. Bill, Jonathan, best of luck with your races. We'll be following you, and we hope to get you back to Big Ten after you both win. So, and Bill, you're coming back in July, so everyone will see Bill in July with Mary Peltola. So, have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.